Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with another free VST tutorial and showcase featuring the Crunk V2 and analog rack series by Nembrini Audio. I first became aware of the Nembrini name about 1 or 2 years ago when they released an SLO plugin, kind of an all-in-one solution to achieve Soldano tones. They also have a 2210 by Marshall that is sonically similar to the amplifier we're looking at today, just more fleshed out. And even the free analog rack series that we're looking at is a part of a premium bundle that includes, I believe, 5 more different racks, like a tube screamer, a compressor, a reverb plugin that isn't available for free, but there's still some pretty cool inclusions here. I think they make like a Marshall Governor, VST, lots of cool stuff. But I figured once I learned that there was some free offerings as well, it was about time we take a look at those. Now, out of full transparency, I don't think this is going to be as metal as some of the other free VST tutorials out there. And, you know, it does get into some classic crunch and even thrash metal territory, though I'm not sure it's all that different or better than some of the other stuff we've looked at. Either way, this is an interesting amplifier, and there's some really great effects in here to where, you know, if you deviate at all from chug, 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 you'll want to take a look at these. And it can do that as well. It's just not as user-friendly or great sounding out of the box for those applications compared to some of the stuff we've looked at in the past, but still a worthy inclusion on your library, I would say. So with that, let's get rolling. Let's kick this off with what I suppose is the centerpiece of today's video, though that could certainly be argued later on. The Crunk V2. Now, this is the successor to the original Crunk plugin, which I only just learned of its existence when this released a couple months ago, though apparently it was one of the earliest works of Igor Nembrini, the namesake of Nembrini Audio, and both of these plugins are based on the Marshall 2210 amplifier, which, to say the least, is not Marshall's most popular 2000 series, you know, whatever amplifier. It's, you know, in theory, kind of like a JCM 800 with a clean channel. In practice, it doesn't get a whole lot of love, and I think some of that is reflected in this plugin itself, which is to say it's rather accurate sounding to a lot of the demos I've heard. But I definitely have some gripes with the bass circuit and the way that, you know, this behaves in general. But if you're looking for kind of a different flavor of Marshall style thing that isn't purely Plexi or purely JCM 800 or JCM 2000 or JVM or Hot Rod Plexi mods, whatever, this is, I think, at least worth looking at. I'll cover the behavior of this amplifier more in detail for each use case we go through, but in general, the gain structure is really interesting and rather usable for, well, at least half of its range. This is one of those annoying amps where at zero gain, there's no output, and I think anywhere past about here is completely unusable. Even with the lowest output single coil pickups, it's just too saturated, too flubby. It doesn't sound good, in my opinion. Around here is where you get sort of that classic JTM 45 or even Plexi normal channel clean to breakup sound. Really nice, I think. One of the nicer Marshall style clean to break up tones I've heard out of a plugin. Around here, I think is where 99% of the tones are at in this, for dirty to crunch to, hairband sounds. If you're plugging straight into this virtual preamp, this is where you're getting, I think, most of those classic tones. If you're cutting a lot of the low end, or you're using a tube screamer in front of this, then you might be able to push it a little higher. But around here is where I think the sweet spot lies, and it kind of sounds ridiculous. And I think this is due to the 2210 circuit using clipping diodes somewhere in the signal path, and you can do all kinds of Zener clippers and stuff that sounds really cool. But I think the JCM 900, at least a couple of the revisions, do the same thing, and that's why a lot of people don't like those. So kind of feel their pain on this one. The tone stack is your typical Marshall affair, where it's kind of dummy proof, and in some instances, especially on some of the cleaner sounds, it doesn't sound like it does much of anything. The master volume control also accurately reflects all of these 2203 style circuits, where there's kind of a sweet spot between around here to here, especially for lower gain sounds, where it really thickens up those low mids, kind of adds some natural compression, and I think lets you get by with lower gain settings in general. You'll see as I lower the gain, I will probably raise the master volume to kind of add those nice tube sounding qualities. And then as I raise the gain, I go for more contemporary tones, I'll lower this back down to let the preamp tubes do most of the work here. Presence control works like a presence control, and you got an output volume level. The cabinet, which is included, is less than remarkable. I would say it's serviceable. It's probably just some 4x12 V30 loaded Marshall some kind. I would have preferred to have an IR loader within this plugin itself, just to save one more spot. It's not a huge deal, and I will use this built-in IR a few times in the demonstrations. But yeah, I think if you want to get the most out of this, be prepared to use your own, which isn't all that big of a deal. And finally, this thing scales, which is always nice to see, even if the artwork doesn't, scale perfectly. Not everyone has perfect eyesight or the, perfect resolution scaling on their own laptop or desktop setup, so it's always nice to see this. This does include some factory presets, 6, I believe. Yes, so we got 2 clean, 2 crunch, 2 leads, and you can even switch between an A and B setup if you want to compare a couple sounds. So, if you want to see what this tone stack sounds like versus the tone stack set to here, and you want to be able to swap to it on the fly, that's a pretty cool feature. Definitely could stand to see that in more plugins. But in general, I still think a lot of my go-to tricks for kind of livening up preamplifier plugins will still apply here. There does appear to be a power amp section modeled here, given the master volume and presence controls, but I still feel like there's something missing here compared to some of the other plugins we look at, and especially Real Tube Head, to the point that, something like TPA1 from Ignite Amps is definitely worth using, and I will use this in a couple of these scenarios here, if for nothing else, just to act like a secondary EQ stage. But, this resonance control on this really makes it sound like it's reacting to a speaker. The impedance of that 12-inch speaker is pushing the power amp in different ways to kind of scoop out those boxy, boomy frequencies and make it sound more lifelike. So definitely recommend that, and to use outboard impulse responses. But other than that, it's a pretty cool implementation of a circuit that doesn't get seen a lot. Moving on to the analog racks then, which include 4 of, I believe, 8 of the premium version of this plugin, and I think some of the more interesting ones are here for free, which is nice. So starting off with a simple noise gate, nothing too special here, enough to dial in, and doesn't do anything that we've seen much differently from other noise gates, but it's a good one if you don't have one already. The cleaner, which I think is a pretty cool dummy-proof implementation of something basically everyone does all the time for mixing guitars, which is a glorified low cut and high cut. But what's cool here is it sounds as if it's volume equalizing, or at least loudness equalizing as you turn these controls up, so you don't have to mess with anything after that, which is nice. But if you got a really boomy, low end, say under 90, 75 hertz, turn this up, we'll clean up that. And harsh, if you got some really spiky, ice pick frequencies after 10K, this will take care of that, and it goes much further than that, I think. But I really like that this takes a process that's kind of chock full of technical mumbo jumbo and numbers and variables, and distills it into something that is far more dummy proof, and more importantly allows even a novice to dial in a good sound without being caught up into exactly what they're doing, which I think is pretty good. Then we have the analog chorus, which is, for all intents and purposes, sounds like a Boss CE2 to me. Pretty nice one. Both the rate and depth controls can be set anywhere from extremely subtle to a very aggressive wobble, though this doesn't sound like it's a stereo circuit. That does have the advantage of sounding just as good in front of a clean amp as it does behind one, so I'll end up using it in that fashion for this segment here. And then finally, I think the best one out of all four, the analog rack delay. Now, on its own, this wouldn't be all that interesting to me were it not for this offset control. So, you got your normal time, you got your feedback, your mix. You don't even have low pass, high pass, no modulation, no tape control or anything like that. This is probably, for all intents and purposes, just a plain digital delay that's been maybe post-processed to sound more like a Bucket Brigade device. Maybe they went the whole extra mile and modeled a real circuit. That'd be cool too. It doesn't really matter, because what's cool is as you turn up this offset, one of the channels starts to lag behind the other. Now, you still have the same time on each one, but it makes the stereo image so much larger. Not quite as much as if you had two independent delays hard panned, or at least 50 to 75% panned in each channel, especially if you have some, cross feedback. But still, this implementation is extremely simple, and it's a really nice way to get a cool delay tone that isn't just ping pong in a stereo fashion. And I find that's where a lot of freeware, especially when it comes to delays, defaults to. So definitely worth having in your library if you don't look at any other plugin throughout the rest of this video. Let's get some tone crafting started then with a Spacey clean sound, starting the signal chain with this chorus set to rather subtle rate and depth control settings. I don't want this thing to sound like a flanger. We just want some subtle wobble before going into the amplifier. I've slightly modified the clean B setting, again back here with rather low gain controls. I've set the tone stack to be more hi-fi, quote-unquote, since this isn't as aggressive in terms of a mid-cut as something like a Fender tone stack. You could get by with really low mid controls on this circuit. As I alluded to earlier, high master volume for some natural compression, presence to taste, output to taste as well. And then the analog delay, I've got the time at around 500 milliseconds, a rather big offset of 62%. This will almost entirely depend on the time, I find, and how you want it to sync up. So, if you've got one that's like on a quarter delay or a dotted quarter on the left channel and you want to offset it a little bit, I try to line it up for the next note or the two notes after that or something like that. So that's kind of how I approach offset. Feedback 34% and about 20% in the mix. And this is the sound you get. If you're more of a straight into the amp kind of person, you definitely don't have to make this complicated. So I've stripped all those effects, except I've added just a touch of Roomworks reverb, the built-in reverb and Cubase, nothing fancy, just a plate sound. And we've turned up the gain ever so slightly to the point that, at least for my guitar, It's just a little bit of breakup on a neck single coil if you have a heavy enough pick attack. Otherwise, it kind of sits under that threshold. And then on a bridge humbucker, especially on hard pick attacks, you cross that threshold most of the time and you get a decent amount of dirt. The tone stack, I have it set to roll off the bass just a little bit, push the mids all the way up, which, at least for circuits like this, makes it mostly flat. Added a lot more treble, push the master volume all the way to the max, because, again, I find at these lower gain volumes, that's the difference between a okay and a great sound. Presence, I've got it right at the second mark there, and I'm still using the built-in cabinet, as I think, especially below noon on the gain control, it does work rather well. Now we're finally getting into some tones that kind of goes along with my channel motto. This is sort of my classic rock or late 70s to early 80s metal setup. If I was doing a more thrashy sound, I would definitely boost this with something like a Tube Screamer model or derivative thereof, but for more radio-friendly genres, this mostly works. Got the gain barely past noon, almost 1 o'clock. The tone stack, kind of my go-to classic rock sound, bass and treble barely past noon again, mids to taste, but given the cab here, I do like it around the 2, a little less than 3 region. Again, master volume, I've turned it significantly down. It can sound really good even further up, but just the level of saturation with the preamp was to my liking already. A little bit of presence, and again, still sticking with the 4x12 V30, but to spice some things up, I've thrown on the Ignite Amps TPA1, and I've added a little bit of depth. We've turned up the resonance all the way, so this simulates that impedance reaction you get, and basically scoops out a lot of the low mids and makes it not sound so boxy or honky. This is one of those effects where you hear it on and you're like, oh, that's pretty good. And then you turn it off and you're like, oh my God, turn it back on already. It sounds horrible. We've got EL34 model tubes, which again is probably double stacking with a power amp that's already emulated here, but listen to your ears. If you like it better with it, keep it on. And in this case, I did. Let's dive into some more advanced signal chains as we round this out with some actual metal tones. I wanted to avoid the Tube Screamer boost cliche at all costs, though I'm ultimately doing something very similar with parametric EQ. You can do this in whatever plugin that you prefer. Plenty of free ones out there. I'm using Cubase's built-in studio EQ. I'm rolling off all the bass under 275-ish hertz, and then boosting at around 800. You can move this front or back depending on your guitar or tonal needs. If you like the super overdrive sound, this is actually around 900 to 1000. If you like that setting around noon like I do, And ultimately, we're just getting rid of some of the flub and accentuating the mids going into the amp, because this is definitely an amp that needs to be boosted for any sort of contemporary metal sound. For the first half of this, I've got gain around here, which is why I don't have the output boosting all that much. This is one of those amp models where you can stand to turn up the gain a lot and then kind of use that as your clean boost, quote unquote. Not all amplifiers behave like that, though. The tone stack I have set to very contemporary settings, high bass and treble, very low mids, though, this starts to sit more like a 5150 in the mix at that point. Lower the master volume. We want the preamp to do all the work here. No presence, just because of what I'm doing later in the signal chain, and max output for the same reason. I'm going to start to bypass the cabinet here, because in addition to the TPA1 plugin, which I will once again take advantage here and even add some different settings to just kind of spice things up, increased feedback, increased depth and presence, I'm also going to use some custom impulse responses using the old NAT-IR, just because I still like working with this one even more than I do the newer implementation of it. These are some random free ones that I had sitting in my library. You can find them on the Google Drive. And then we're going to round this out with the analog noise gate and cleaner. I'm not really playing any staccato stuff here, so the noise gate won't be doing a whole lot until the signal starts to decay, but the cleaner will act as kind of an additional round of polish in addition to what NAT-IR already does. So I would kind of view this more as a mixing utility rather than like a core tonal attribute to my guitar sound, but it's still useful in cleaning up something like a muddy or a really fizzy, harsh impulse response. We can apply the same philosophy to extended range guitar tones as well, though I've opted to move the cutoff and the boost frequencies up quite a bit to get a grindier DI signal and increase the output volume, just kind of compensate for the fact that we're cutting off more of the low end. This does have an auto gain feature, but not everything does, so I tend to do this by ear anyway. Now, the amplifier itself, this is not the ideal circuit by any means for drop tuned 7 strings or 8 strings especially. It works. Obviously, I'll show that here, but if you're just kind of getting acclimated to this sort of stuff, I would definitely recommend some of the more contemporary circuit emulations we've looked at in the past. They'll be more plug and play than this is, but if you want a different tone, then this is, one avenue to get you there. Using TPA1 again, letting the presence of the amp do all the work. Still got resonance cranked, a little bit of negative feedback, and EL34 tubes. Using not the original NAT-IR with some of my own impulse responses just for something different, and still using the cleaner and the noise gate plugins as before. Overall, I would say the Nembrini audio freeware is a worthy addition to your VST library, whether or not you're already using premium plugins. The Crunk V2 is pretty cool in the fact that it's not just your same old retread of a classic JCM 800 circuit or, a dual rec or 5150 that is kind of hard to beat some of the stuff we've already looked at on this channel. This does still tread Marshall territory, but the workflow is different. It's a circuit that I think most people don't even think twice about, so it's nice to see it get some love in some way. And the included cabinet's decent enough. Wouldn't be my first choice for a lot of stuff, but it's a quick grab and go, plug in and play kind of setup. So definitely give them props for that. The analog racks are included for free. The top two, noise gate and cleaner, definitely wouldn't say they're standout, but it is nice to have some different workflow options. The chorus is rather nice. Not my favorite implementation I've ever heard, but it is simple and it works the way you think it should. And delay is absolutely a standout. This offset control kind of makes this magical, in my opinion. And then, couple that with the fact that these do sort of respond in an analog way when they clip internally, depending on how you have the input and output options set. You do get sort of some warm distortion. So if you're trying to emulate that sound, that's a pretty cool way to have that kind of ingrained into these tools. So they definitely work more like analog gear than I think a lot of modeled equipment does out there. So overall, thumbs up for me. Definitely say give these effects a shot if nothing else. So that'll do it for me. Any questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.